Ms. Day, are you ready to proceed?
Yeah.
All right, if you'll go ahead and bring Mr. Smith.
Please be seated and remain quiet. Superior Court's back in session.
All right, Ms. D.
Your Honor, the reason we wanted to have a brief partisan conversation with Mr. Smith this morning was so that he would understand that in addition to some of the elements that were discussed in opening, that there are a few other sort of similar elements that will be discussed in closing, and make sure that he's aware of those and understands that they're going to be said and does not object to them insofar as they constitute admissions. And I think the two main ones were that I intend to make a reference in the course of my closing to the fact that he was not completely truthful with law enforcement when he gave his statement, and that I give a few specific examples, and I told him what those examples would be. And I also will make some reference to the fact that based on Melvin Brown, Terrell Williams, knowing that his father had kicked him out of the house and that he had a young son, is it reasonable for the jury to assume that they did have some sort of conversation at some point when they were housed together. So those were the two sort of specific items.
In addition to items that we had discussed pre-opening.
All right, very good. If I may, I'd like to make an inquiry of your client with respect to these matters. So, Mr. Smith, I want to have a conversation with you about these matters that your attorney just discussed with me, as well as matters I discussed with you prior to the opening statements in this case. First of all, do you understand, sir, that you do have the right to remain silent? Anything you say can be used against you?
Yes, sir.
All right. Have you had an opportunity, Mr. Smith, to discuss this case thoroughly with your attorneys?
Yes, sir.
And in those conversations, have you had the opportunity to discuss with them strategic decisions that they believe to be in your best interest with respect to this case?
Yes, sir.
And do you understand the strategies that they intend to follow, not only throughout this trial, but specifically with respect to the closing arguments that are about to be made to the jury?
Yes, sir.
Your attorneys have indicated to me that they intend to make several statements that could be viewed as concessions in this matter, and those are three that we talked about earlier. One, that you were involved into breaking into cars on May 13 and perhaps the early morning hours of May 14 in the vicinity of the crime that was committed that is the issue of this case. They will also be conceding that you were in the presence of the co-defendants, Ms. Redden and Mr. Anthony, both before and after the crime that is the subject of this case, and they intend to concede that you were involved in selling stolen property, and that property was related to the crime was committed in this case. They have also indicated to me in the closing arguments that the attorneys intend to concede that you were not completely truthful with law enforcement officers when you made your statement to, I believe, Detective Gibney, and that you are also going to concede that you did have conversations with Melvin Brown while you and he were housed together in the Wake County Jail. Do you understand all of those things I've just described for you, sir?
Yes.
All right. And do you understand, sir, that it is the obligation of the state and the burden on the state to prove each element in this case beyond a reasonable doubt? Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
And do you understand that if your attorneys concede these facts that I just went over with you to the jury, then the jury can accept those as true? Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
And you understand that that, in effect, relieves the state of its burden of proving each of these things beyond a reasonable doubt. Do you understand?
Yes, sir.
Do you specifically consent to your attorneys adopting this strategy that I've just described to you?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you've had ample time to discuss this strategy with your attorneys. Is that correct? Yes, sir. All right. Very good. Anything further, Ms. Brown? Mr. Keating, Mr. Waller?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'm going to find that Mr. Smith understands that these concessions are going to be made, that he has had the opportunity to discuss them with his attorney, and that he voluntarily consents to his attorneys adopting this strategy and making these concessions as part of the closing arguments that are to be made in this case. All right, very good. Let's go ahead then and bring the jurors in. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Thank you all for arriving promptly, so get underway, and appreciate your patience this morning. Hopefully the weather did not cause you too much distress yesterday. As I mentioned to you, all of the evidence in this case has been presented, and it's now time for the final arguments of the lawyers. At the conclusion of these arguments, I will instruct you on the law in this case, and you'll then be taken to the jury room to begin your deliberations. The final arguments of the lawyers are not evidence, but they are given to assist you in your evaluation of the evidence. The lawyers are permitted in their final statements to argue, to characterize the evidence, and to attempt to persuade you to a particular verdict. It is improper for a lawyer in a final argument to become abusive, to inject personal experience, or to express a personal belief as to the guilt or innocence of the defendant, or to make an argument on the basis of matters outside of the record of this case. A lawyer may, however, on the basis of the lawyer's analysis of the evidence, argue any position or conclusion with respect to a matter in evidence or at issue. Now, if in the course of the making of a final argument a lawyer attempts to restate the evidence and your recollection of the evidence differs from that of the lawyer, you're to be guided exclusively by your own recollection of the evidence in this case. Now, in this case, we're going to hear the first argument on behalf of the defense through Ms. D. Then we will hear the argument of the state through Mr. Waller, and then we'll hear the final argument on behalf of the defense through Mr. Brown. Ms. D.
Mr. Waller and Mr. Brown are both going to get up, and they're going to argue to you about what the evidence showed in this case, and they're going to argue to you about the law that the judge is going to instruct you on. And they are going to ask you to consider the evidence and the law in a way that they hope will urge you to find this case in the favor of the state of North Carolina or Travion Smith. Before they do that, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk to you about some facts in this case and some of the evidence in this case that neither side can do anything but accept as true. So what are some of those facts? This was a brutal and senseless murder. Melissa Huggins-Jones was beaten to death in her bed over some stuff, over some meaningless stuff. And Hannah had to find her mother in that bloody bed, and Hannah and Noah and everyone else that loved Melissa had their lives torn apart by this murder. Those things are true. And there are other facts in this case that are true as well. Mr. Brown told you in his opening that this trial was about Travion Smith, but that this crime was about Ronald Anthony. And after the first week of this case, I trust that you could see some of what he was talking about, because everyone in this case is involved because of Ronald Anthony. He's the one with the dynamic personality, and he's the one that everybody is connected to. So Sarah Redden, the 18-year-old at the time girl who was there with them that night, who was willing to go out and go along with this, crime spree just because she wanted to be able to be there and be with Ronald Anthony. And Amber Alberts, his other, I would call real girlfriend, who had put up with him for years. My recollection is she said on and off for 6 years, despite all of his cheating, because she loved him. And Michael McCullum, who was somewhat older than Mr. Anthony and who had just met him in passing at, I think, a Raleigh hotel one evening and then ran into him at the Wake Forest Walmart sometime later. And he just liked him. He was good company. He was a young man who he felt like had some similar struggles in life, and he chose to be friends with him, and they stayed friends for the remainder of the time, basically 2013 up until when this happened. And there's the person who we didn't hear from. Just a second, ladies and gentlemen. I should have this nearby. But the person who Ronald Anthony called, according to Sarah Redden, to come and pick them up that evening, who he was comfortable enough calling for that ride, and who who Sarah Redden testified that he talked to in the front of the car. It's Ronald Anthony's Marijuana Anonymous meeting. Travion Smith and Sarah Redden are just there to kind of wait on him and be in his orbit. And finally, it's Travion Smith who at this point in his life was relying on Ronald Anthony and the circle of people who surrounded him and supported him, who supported Ron. Travion was using that whole network of connections for everything, for a place to sleep, for a roof over his head, and for the food he was eating, and for the clothes he was wearing. So I want to go through and I want to talk about what are some of the uncontroverted facts we learned from these witnesses and from the other witnesses who testified at the trial, and some other similarly clear facts that come through when you look at the physical evidence. So we know there are a lot of cars that were broken into, a lot of cars. I mean, we had cars broken into in the neighborhood. Well, first of all, there were cars that were broken into up north of Six Forks North Hills Mall. And then there were cars that were broken into in some of these other neighborhoods, and then there were cars broken into down here on the sort of lower half of Allister Drive, beneath the development. And we know that Ronald Anthony and Travion Smith and Sarah Redden were responsible for those break-ins. We know the times of all those calls. We've seen the CAD reports, we've heard from most of the officers, and we know when people made those 911 calls. We know when officers were in the area of Melissa's apartment building. And we know that that's consistent with what Sarah Redden testified to when she would see the patrol cars coming through and how that would cause her to run and hide again, and is consistent with what Travion Smith said in his statement that you watched the video up to the police. So we know that. And we know that and we know because of that, and based on the CAD reports and the timeline, roughly where the three of them were before the murder was committed. And that was largely in this area down here. And this big rectangular building is the condominium where Esther Hall lived and where Claire Reynolds lived. And that's the condominium building that has the gated parking underneath. So if you pull in from the back, right here, you're facing, so you can see that that road seems to continue, and where it continues is under the building through that gate. So we don't know whether there was evidence of a tool being used to pry open the bars of the parking deck below the condominiums, because there were no pictures taken at this precise scene. There might have been some processing done of the vehicles. But Sarah Redden says that Ronald Anthony pulled the bars apart with his hands, and Detective Falk described the bars in his report as being pulled/pried, or he said in court that they had been marked with tool marks, and that's also what he recollected was in his handwritten notes. So that's just a point where we could know a little bit more and we don't. But we do know, based on that evidence, where they were and some of what happened in that location. And we know that Sarah testified that that was something that Ron was able to do with his hands. We know that preservation of evidence is a cornerstone of police work. We heard that from so many people in this case. Early on in the case, whenever the issue of what was the CCBI would come up, it would be described as the entity that went out to photograph and preserve the scenes and the evidence for the Raleigh Police Department. And Tracy Gold gave, I think, very similar definitions of that to the other witnesses when she said that her job was the documentation, collection, and preservation of evidence. And we heard from Sergeant Lampe, who was one of the very first officers on the scene, that one of the most important things that he does is make sure to preserve evidence, and that's why when he and the other young officer first came in, they immediately backed out when they realized what sort of scene it was, so they wouldn't do anything to disturb the evidence that was there. So what else do we know? We know that 2 Lenovo computers were stolen from the downstairs leasing apartment. It's been called a lot in the course of the trial, or the burglary. And we know that that's what they were stolen from Kane Realty, and Kane Realty was using that space as a temporary leasing office. And 2 computers were stolen from there that were stored down there. The computers were kind of the key over the course of the investigation and the course of the trial, because the computers are what led the police to Michael McCollum, and Michael McCollum is what essentially led the police to the other evidence and to the other witnesses that they interviewed. And we heard from Michael McCollum in this trial. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we learned from him. We learned that he really liked Ron. We learned that he trusted him. He trusted him not to, try and sell him anything that would get him involved in a bad situation. And we know that he was disappointed, angry at Ron in a way that one only feels about people about whom you care. He told us that he'd never met Sarah Redden, and he told us that he met Travion Smith only that one time when Travion sold him the gray laptop computer. And Amber Alberts also testified to this. She said that when she was asked who Michael McCollum was, that he was a friend of Ron's, that she did not believe that Michael had ever met Travion, because during the time when Amber would spend time with Michael McCollum and Ron, Travion was never there. So going back to what Michael McCollum told us that's vital and uncontradicted in this trial, we know that Ron called him when he was working in Goldsboro. He called him on Amber's phone, as he often did. Ron didn't have a phone, so if he used a phone, it would be Amber's phone. He told you that he had been able to identify that number in his phone records, and when Michael McCollum found out that this is why the police were talking to him, he wanted to do everything he could to help and assist and give them any ideas about what might lead them to more evidence. So he talked about his phone records, and he talked about verifying these calls for them in any way he could. And he was working in Goldsboro when Ronald Anthony initially called him. And when Ron called him then, he testified that Ron told him he had 2 computers. So at this point early on, Ron is the one sort of in control of the disposition of both of these computers, at least in terms of what he tells Michael McCollum on the phone. And then days later, because Michael McCollum realizes the computers are valuable, he wants to be able to sell them because he knows that he'll be able to make some money for himself. So Michael McCollum follows up with Ron And days later, Ron sends the pictures of the orange Lenovo that we've all seen, and he uses those pictures to post the ad to Craigslist. And Detective Morse sees the ad on Craigslist, thinks it's the right computer, is able to work with folks at Lenovo to get confirmation of that, and so when he goes out to try and meet with Michael McCollum, Detective Morse is pretty sure that this computer is going to be their link to some additional evidence in this case. Michael McCollum gets spooked. He says nobody ever offers you full price on Craigslist. He's sort of just got a bad feeling about this whole thing. He never got the computer anyhow. He takes it down. And from his perspective, he's hoping maybe that's going to be the end of him having any uncomfortable situation with that computer. But the next day, or I think it was the next day, Travion Smith calls on Amber Albert's phone. And he doesn't know Travion Smith, so Travion Smith has to identify himself as Taz's friend and explain that he's got the second computer that Ron had told him about before, and he has it, there in Wake Forest available to sell to him. So Michael McCollum has his girlfriend go pick Travion up at the Walmart. He brings him back. He gives him a small amount of money up front and promises to give him more money later, and Travion sells him the computer. And that computer is found by the Raleigh Police Department when they go and execute the search warrant up in Wake Forest. After the police make the connection to Michael McCollum, they quickly tie in Travion Smith and Ronald Anthony because they had all of the various surveillance units up there. So one of the surveillance units follows Travion from Michael McCollum's house back to the Walmart, and Ron's at the Walmart. Various other of their friends are either at that Walmart or they're at that sort of strip of restaurants where the hibachi Japanese place is and the Andy's restaurant that's sort of out in the parking lot area outside the Walmart. So the surveillance units that are there at the Walmart are then sort of able to sort of see all of those folks interacting around the Walmart. And from our purposes, we're now back inside that network of people that sort of surround and support Ronald Anthony. So who's the next person who we heard from, who the police found that day up in Wake Forest, who was able to give the police more information that they used in the course of this investigation? Well, that's Amber Alberts. She's the first of Ron's two girlfriends who testified at this trial. As I said earlier, she's sort of the person, his actual girlfriend, who had sort of had that relationship with him for years, who told you that she continued to be in contact with Ron until December of 2015, after he had pled guilty and been sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Melissa Huggins-Jones. He told you that he cheated on her with a lot of girls, a lot of different girls, a lot of them, and that he lived with her when he felt like it. He often used her phone because he couldn't afford one of his own. And she remembers him acting sort of suspicious that day when he came back, but since he acted suspicious all the time because he always had a guilty conscience, she wasn't able to sort of tell any difference about his behavior that day from any other day. She told you that Travion Smith came to live with them in April, so the month before, that Travion had been kicked out and that he had nowhere to stay. She told you that he called one evening and it was pouring down rain, and she felt sorry for him. So she had somebody go and pick him up, presumably Michelle and Joey, because they're the only ones that seem to have had a car. But I mean, my recollection of her testimony is that she felt sorry for him, so they had somebody go and pick him up. And when he was there, sleeping on the couch in the living room and sort of wearing Ron's clothes and sort of just being there, she didn't talk to him very much. She said he was really quiet. He would sit on the couch and stare off into space. She told you that she did know who Michael McCollum was, that he was a friend of Ron's, and she knew that Michael McCollum and Travion Smith had not met before. She let the police search her phone. She voluntarily gave the police her phone, and she helped the police search the home out in Oxford. She helped them find all of the items that they were looking for when they came out there. including the bag of stolen items that was on Ron's side of the bed in their bedroom. So none of those items were in the living room where Travion slept. They were all together in the bag that Ron was maintaining there next to the bed. And later, when she found Claire Reynolds' iPod, she called the police and said, I found this iPod, somebody come get this iPod. So again, like Michael McCollum, she made efforts to do everything she could to cooperate with the police and give them whatever information that she could think of that would help them in their investigation. She told us that after Ron was arrested, he wrote to her and asked her to destroy the clothes that were still up there at the Oxford home. Of course, the clothes had already been taken by the police, but she lets you know that he was still concerned about that and writing to her about that after his arrest. She told you how supportive Ron's mom was of him, that she would always give Ron rides, that she always brought him fresh clothes, and her exact words when answering these questions was that Ron's mom was always there for him. She told you that during the time Travion Smith was living with her, none of his family or friends ever came and helped him in any way during that month plus amount of time. And finally, she told you that Ron had a temper, that there was a history of domestic violence in their relationship, and that her mother had been very unhappy about the relationship. And then we heard from Sarah Redden, Ron's other girlfriend, who was 18 years old, 18 years young when all this happened. She told you about meeting Ronald Anthony through work friends and dating him, believing she was his girlfriend for several months in 2013. She said that sometimes she would hang out with Ron and Trey, which is what she called Travion, and sometimes she would hang out with just Ron. And that night, they were all hanging out after Ron's meeting, breaking into cars, using the gloves that she said Ronald Anthony had purchased at a gas station, sitting around the Bonefish Grill where Sarah Melvin told you that Travion Smith sat a bit apart and listened to his headphones, and going to Ben & Jerry's and all the different aspects of that evening that she testified about. Now, according to Sarah Redden, at one point that evening, Ronald told her to wait here. And according to her, that was in this building where one of the witnesses has, perhaps Sarah Redden, placed this silver thumbtack, which is next to the building with the blue thumbtack, which is where Melissa Huggins-Jones was living. And so, although it looks sort of pretty close to finished in this picture, this was all, the fence that we've all heard about still came throughout this area. So she was on the other side of the fence in that unfinished building because Ron told her to wait there. And that at that same time, Ron told Travion Smith to come with him. And that's according to Sarah Redden. She saw the police patrols and she got worried. She went out and she said that she saw Travion Smith on the balcony and that when she asked him where Ron was, he pointed back inside the apartment. Later, she said they had the computers and they were over near this fence line, which is right down close to where the big brick wall ends. That's close to the area that everyone has testified about there. And that they were pouring water over their hands. Ronald Anthony told her to jump the fence and told her to hold the bag while he jumped the fence. He told her to hold on to an iPhone while he was jumping the fence, and then he told her to give the iPhone back. Ron used her phone to call someone to come and pick them up and give them a ride. And let's talk about where they sit in the car. When this person comes to pick them up at North Hills Mall, Ronald Anthony is in the front passenger seat next to the driver. And Sarah Redden is in the back passenger seat behind the driver. And Travion Smith, as tall as he is in the middle seat in between Sarah Redden and the baby seat. That is not the position of privilege in that car ride. What other things does Sarah Redden tell us about the car ride? She said that Ronald Anthony was in the front seat talking to Reese. They talked about different things, and while they were talking, she said that Ronald Anthony showed Reese two things. He showed him a bloody knife and an iPhone. She told you that Travion Smith did not talk during the car ride, and she thought she saw him look down at something on his shirt that she thought was specks of blood. She told you that Ronald Anthony had all the money, because she told you that Ronald Anthony gave Reese money to buy gas for picking them up. And Ronald Anthony also gave Reese money to buy him, Ronald Anthony, a pack of cigarettes. When they get to the hotel later, Ronald Anthony pays for that hotel room with cash, and Ronald Anthony goes out while they're in the hotel room to get snacks for everybody. Sarah Redden makes it clear by telling you all those things that she and Travion Smith never had any money that night. When they get to the club, because that's where Reese takes them, Reese had borrowed his girlfriend's car, I think Sarah Redden told us that, and so they had to go to where she wanted her car returned, which was this club, Flashbacks, on Capitol Boulevard. So they get the ride back to the club, and Ronald Anthony changes all his clothes, and he goes inside the strip club with his friend until the strip club closes. And Travion Smith and Sarah Redden just kind of wait out in the parking lot for him to sort of come back and engage with them again. He does come out eventually and tells them that they are going to get a hotel room. They go to the Motel 6, which he registers for and pays for. Sarah Redden tells you that when they're at the hotel room, everyone's pretty quiet. The laptops are there. And Ronald Anthony wants to watch the news. And at one point, Travion Smith says to Ronald Anthony, "What the hell just happened?" Sarah Redden said Travion Smith was upset, talking about his son. And we don't know all the details, but we know that Sarah felt like Ronald Anthony was annoyed with Travion Smith. About a week later, Sarah Redden still wants to hang out with Ronald Anthony. She still wants to be his girlfriend. And so after this night, so she goes with him to sell the orange laptop to Julius Bumpers. She told you about how her relatively short relationship with Ronald Anthony turned ugly over the time they were together, that he would hurt her and leave bruises, and that she was afraid of him. She said he liked to be the one that was in control of everything. Mr. Waller asked her a question in an effort to sort of separate out sort of her relationship in regards to Mr. Anthony and Travion's relationship to Mr. Anthony. And she said something very interesting. She said that Travion did what Ron told him. Sarah told us a little bit about what happened at Ben & Jerry's. But we learned a lot more about what happened at Ben & Jerry's from Amy Radley, who was the manager of the Ben & Jerry's at the time. We learned that Sarah Redden and Travion Smith were filling out job applications. They were actually filling out job applications. They were loud. They were disruptive. They were having a disagreement, according to Amy Radley, about a question on the back of the form about misdemeanor convictions. So she told them, "Don't bother filling out these applications. I'm the manager. I'm not going to hire you." And how did they react when being sort of confronted in this way from the manager at the Ben & Jerry's? They were quiet. They didn't say anything to her. They left. And then later, when someone pointed her out to Ronald Anthony came into the Starbucks where she was talking to a friend of hers, and she had to call security because of Ronald Anthony's treatment of her and anger about a situation that he had nothing to do with. But that's not the craziest or most interesting thing we learned about Ronald Anthony from Amy Radley. After this murder, Ronald Anthony developed a romantic relationship with one of her coworkers at the Ben & Jerry's. She told you that when he would call from the Ben & Jerry's, or when he would call her from the jail, her friend, who was working at the Ben & Jerry's, it was so important to this woman to talk to Ronald Anthony when he would call her on the phone, that if the coworker woman was so busy working that she wasn't able to answer the phone at that exact moment, she would pass it to a coworker so somebody else could answer the phone, and she wouldn't miss her chance to talk to Ronald Anthony that day. That tells you a lot about the kind of personality he has and the magnetism he has and how much people want to be in relationships with him and in his orbit. It also tells you a lot that Ronald Anthony realized and was savvy enough to know that if he had an opportunity to apologize to Amy Radley, he should take it. So those are some of the folks that we heard from that sort of speak to sort of what Mr. Brown said initially, that this is a crime about Ronald Anthony. But we heard from some other witnesses as well over the course of the trial. And one of them was Melvin Brown. And what to say about Melvin Brown? When a person swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then in the very next question, in response to what is your name, he gives a name that's not his name, what does one do with that? He knows his name is Terrell Williams. He knows his name is not Melvin Brown. So his answers have to be put in the context of realizing that he certainly is aware of, at a minimum, his actual name. Otherwise, Travion Smith apparently talked to him. He knew that Travion Smith had a son. He knew that Travion Smith's father had kicked him out. But so much of Melvin Brown's story, such as Sarah Redden having worked for Melissa Huggins-Jones, and therefore her, Melissa Huggins-Jones, having been specifically targeted in this crime, those things are all just totally wrong. So, as you heard from the witness stand, Mr. Brown, Mr. Williams, has a huge motivation to provide substantial assistance in this case, and he doesn't really know what happened in the apartment. But he was housed with Travion Smith, and Travion talked to him about some things at some point. I submit that none of that provides anything that can be included in a list of things that we know. There's nothing about his testimony that can go on that list. And for the rest of what to do with his testimony, you will have to make the decisions that you make based on the instructions about how to judge credibility. You also heard Travion's statement to the police, and you will have to judge it with those same tests of credibility that you judge all of the other witnesses and evidence in this case. Did he tell the whole truth to the police? No. He eliminated Reese, the guy who gave them a ride, completely from the story. He insisted that they walked all the way to Capitol Boulevard. Initially, although he changes over time, he tries to say that Sarah wasn't there for parts of the evening when all the evidence that you've heard tells you that she was. But he gave a basic timeline correctly. He has everybody ending up at Capitol Boulevard and at the Super 8 at the end of the night. And he confirmed, as the other witnesses have, about when the different patrols came through and when the police were present in the neighborhood. He told you again, as everybody else has, that Ron was older and wanted to be in control. And he told the police that he called his father the next day and told his dad what happened. But the police did not feel like that. They didn't follow up on that or give it credence. But he told them that, and he gave them that opportunity to look into that further and find out more. He volunteered that he had cut his hands on the fence right where the police suspected the fence had been drawn, the fence had been jumped. And he showed them where they attempted to take the photographs of the poison ivy on his hand as well. Finally, in addition to the witness testimony, you heard about physical evidence that was collected at the scene. And some of that physical evidence is very straightforward. You heard from Agent DeHaan, and you heard that Melissa Huggins-Jones' her DNA was found both inside and outside of her apartment. Neither side, in this case, can alter that fact, change that fact, or do anything else with that fact, because that is true. And you will have an opportunity when you go back to deliberate, spend some time with different photos, but State's Exhibit 3 is one of the pieces of evidence that was submitted in this case. And you'll be able to look and see where those different positive DNA results were found outside the apartment on both sides of either the patio or the deck. Neither side can change that. Similarly straightforward, there were no fingerprints of any relevance or value collected in this case. And we know the state can't link the cuts on Travion's palms to struggle with Melissa Huggins-Jones, because we know they took and tested samples underneath her fingernails to see if that connection could be made. We know that Melissa Huggins-Jones was always on her phone. Her mom testified to that, Dawn Wallace, when she came up and told you about her evening with Melissa that day and what she knew about what had happened. She told you she was always on her phone. And you can see that that is supported by the crime scene photos that show that she apparently had the phone plugged in, charging right there with her in the bed. And because we can see where the phone was plugged in right there with her in the bed, you could conclude that the phone was stolen right there at the exact location where she was murdered. We know that Sarah says Ron had the phone afterwards in the car with Reese. And we have heard Travion's statement, you have heard Travion's statement, where he doesn't give any information to the police about locating the phone. And you've heard Sarah's testimony on the witness stand, and she didn't have any information. She said she had no idea what happened to the phone after that evening. So Detectives Gill and Brady went out to that wooded area by the Wake Forest Walmart based on somebody suggesting that that would be a place where they could find the phone. And having heard from Sarah Redden on the witness stand and hearing Travion Smith's statement in this case, it's a reasonable assumption for you as jurors that that information came from Ronald Anthony, which is consistent with Sarah's testimony about him having the phone after the murder and in the car, asking her to hold it and talking to Reese about it during the ride. We know there was mud downstairs in the entrance area of the leasing unit apartment. There are photos of that were published for you during the trial. And we know that there was mud. Agent Gold showed you the pillows and the exhibits that still showed the brown mud on them that had been collected from Melissa Huggins-Jones' bedroom. And you can see that mud in the photos as well that were taken of that room. And you can see on the photos that were taken of the blue shoes, the shoes that were recovered in the Oxford home, the mud that was on them in the treads on the bottom and on the top of the shoes back in 2013. And a small amount of that mud is still on those shoes today. There's no mud on the red shoes. There are the fabric impressions. And what do we know about the fabric impressions? The honest answer is very little. We've heard from numerous witnesses in this case that for any sort of latent evidence comparison, you must have a known and an unknown. And there were no gloves collected in the course of this investigation. And that is important because without a known, you can't analyze, for instance, whether the same item might have multiple surfaces. So some gloves might have one surface along the fingertips and have a different surface on the remainder of the glove. And without anything to make a comparison, then you can't make any meaningful analysis of the fabric impressions or where they came from. All we can do at that point is guess, and that's not a lot to go on. But for the value that it has, many witnesses have told you about the distinctive dot pattern that was on the bedpost in Melissa's bedroom. And that, again, would be right there where she was murdered, right there where the phone was taken. And when you go back and deliberate, you can. State's Exhibit 160 is a photo that will show you the picture that Tracy Gold took of the dot pattern on the bedpost. And you can take from that what you feel comfortable taking from. You will also see that dot pattern on other locations, such as the inside of the sliding glass door. And I would argue, importantly, if you look in States 189, you'll see that distinctive dot pattern. And that would be on as you're facing, most of the witnesses have given evidence about the location of these different items, and I'm just showing you again State's Exhibit 3 because it shows you the apartment from the parking lot side. So this is the side where you can see both the patio to the leasing office and Melissa Huggins-Jones' deck. And most folks have referred to this as being the left as you face it, which is the side where the windows were gone through to go into the leasing office, or the right side, which is the side where the dryer vent that you heard a lot about is located. And this pattern appears on the deck, on the upstairs, on the left side as you face the building. The same side where the shoe impressions had limited class characteristic similarities to the blue shoes that were collected in Oxford. And so finally, there are the footwear impressions. And more than anything with the footwear impressions, I would just stress that when you look at the diagram that Agent Davis provided for you as part of her PowerPoint, and you look at where the conclusion of limited association of class characteristics lies on that chart of the different conclusions a footwear examiner can reach, it is just one notch away from a completely neutral position where an analyst would not be able to tell you anything about the footwear impressions. So I would just ask, as you're looking at that, just because they're visual and you can hold them, don't give them more weight than they warrant. Otherwise, I would say that for the limited value that they hold, it would be helpful if Agent Gold had preserved the footwear impression that was in Melissa Huggins-Jones' bedroom at evidence marker 4, so inside her bedroom and behind the door. Both Agent Gold and Agent Davis, so Agent Gold who processed the scene and Agent Davis who did the analysis of the footwear impressions, told you that it's extremely difficult to capture that type of impression in carpet, even if it's new carpet. But Agent Ferran in the downstairs leasing unit apartment, she managed to capture 7 of them, actually cut out and preserve 7 of them. And she also took very comprehensive photographs of all the impressions that she saw downstairs. She told in her report that she had detailed the fact that she used a hardening agent on them before she cut them out, and she testified that yes, there are boxes of all sizes available there at the scene, and that her practice is to put the evidence in an evidence box at the location that she's processing, not to put it in a paper bag and to transform it into something else when you got back to the lab later. Again, if we had that, that would be just one more small piece of information about who might or might not have been inside Melissa Huggins-Jones' bedroom when she was murdered. As much evidentiary assistance as the footwear impressions provide, they invite questions as well. Whose shoes, for instance, made the third impression on the left side as you're facing the building on the downstairs? That's where the 3 overlapping impressions were about which Agent Davis testified, 2 of which had the limited class characteristic associations to the blue shoes, and the third of which was excluded from all the shoes that she analyzed. So the question then becomes whose shoes were those? It's a brand new building, and people do not often walk on handrails, so it's not a sort of heavy foot traffic area, and yet in that fairly pristine railing there is at least one completely unexplained footwear impression about which we have no idea. As you listen to the arguments by Mr. Waller and Mr. Brown, please keep these facts in mind, along with everything else you remember and you know to be true from the evidence that you heard at this trial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Davis.
We'll take a 5-minute recess. Members of the jury, I suggest you just go into the deliberation room, relax for 5 minutes, and then we'll resume with the next argument from Mr. Waller. While you're in there, please don't form or express opinions or discuss the case among yourselves. Please leave your notepads in your chairs. Everyone else, please remain seated.